gentlemen, it is the Pro Football Focus Chalk Talk Podcast, Week 15. I am Scott Barrett, joined as always by Tyler Buecher. Tyler, we've got another unique slate to look at. Looks like there's one Thursday game, two Saturday games, one Monday game, the rest on Sundays. Tyler, let's try and cover as much ground as we can, maybe not go too in-depth on each specific player, but try and cover as many guys as we can from this Thursday through Monday slate. I know we don't typically do that, but I think that's the plan for today. Tyler, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, let's go for it. There's a lot at stake here. We saw last week was pretty straightforward. We had a lot of free squares in Giovanni Bernard, Josh Gordon, Trey Burton. It opened up a ton of room for us at every other position where we could spend up for studs like Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins. This week we don't really have those free squares as of now, Wednesday, while we're recording this. There's a couple chalky plays, but we'll get to that as we get into the pod. But as of now, we aren't looking at the free squares like we saw last week.
Right, Tyler. Let's jump right in and get to quarterbacks. Who stands out to you?
So, when I normally try to play a bunch of GPPs, I try to narrow it down to just one or two guys that I want a ton of exposure to. This week, there's so many great quarterbacks to play. It's really difficult. The guy that I kind of want to go heavy on, though, is Cam Newton. Over the Packers' last 3 games, they've allowed, on average, 3 passing touchdowns and just shy of 25 fantasy points to each of their opponents. Newton predictably struggled last week against Minnesota, and he was bailed out by 3 Jonathan Stewart touchdowns. But this could be the week that Newton bails out the Panthers offense, racking up a ton of fantasy points in the process. We've routinely criticized the Packers cornerbacks on this pod because, well, they've been terrible. Injuries are forcing them to go even deeper into the reserves. They just placed Kevin King on IR last week. And on the year, the Packers have allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I just think it sets up for a pretty good game here for Newton, with the return of Aaron Rodgers as well, to be in a potential shootout here where Cam Newton playing at home has a good shot at maybe hitting that 25 fantasy point benchmark that they've allowed over the last few weeks. What do you think about Cam?
I think he's a little too risky for me. Over the past 2 seasons, he ranks second last in passer rating, ahead of just Brock Osweiler. He's eclipsed over 200 passing yards just once over his last 6 games. 43% of his fantasy points has come on the ground, but that's why you're playing him. He's averaging 8.6 carries per game over his last 10 games. You're really banking on rushing production there, but I think I'd actually prefer to play Aaron Rodgers. I know it's a little risky with him coming back, but Carolina's been struggling recently as well, and like you said, it definitely could be a shootout. But those guys aren't really at the top of my list. I think at the quarterback position, there's 2 game stacks I'm really looking at, and the first is probably the most obvious one, or the chalkiest one, and that's the Patriots and Steelers this week.
Oh, well, okay. If we want to talk chalk, let's talk chalk on the Chalk Talk podcast. Okay. It's hard to ever fade Tom Brady. I mean, he's just been a fantastic stud when it comes to fantasy performances. Last week, tough outing against the Dolphins on, I think it was Monday Night Football, and I wouldn't be shocked at all to see him come back with a vengeance here. Playing on the road in Pittsburgh makes that Pittsburgh home game split passing narrative come into play here as well. Who do you like more, Big Ben or Tom Brady?
I'm honestly not sure. So Brady's just destroyed the Steelers in his last 7 games against Pittsburgh. He's averaged 325 yards, 3.14 touchdowns, 0.0 interceptions. I'm kind of hoping that people avoid him this week after the prime time dud he just posted. Maybe that'll be fresh in people's minds, but I'd gladly profit on the panic if that is the case. Pittsburgh ranks 5th worst in terms of fantasy points per game over expectation over their last 5 games. Losing Joe Hayden has killed them, especially deep. They've faced some really gross names in that span, like Brett Hundley, Joe Flacco, Andy Dalton, Marcus Mariota, and all of these quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks had at least 2 touchdowns and 250 yards. And then we could look at Ben, and he's just a completely different quarterback at home, and he's at home this week. Since 2014, his 10 highest scoring games have all come at home. His last 3 home games this season, he finished as the QB2, QB1 of those weeks. Since 2014, he's averaging 8.6 fantasy points per game more at home. His passer rating jumps by 20.2 points. The Patriots have been a lot better recently, but they're giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game over expectation to quarterbacks this season. They're 2nd in plays per game. I know this is chalk. You brought it up at the start, but it's going to be hard to avoid both these quarterbacks and a bunch of players on these teams.
We just take a moment to enjoy that the Steelers are on the main slate for once. They're playing on a Sunday. It's been over a month, I believe, since the last time they've been on that. So we finally have access to all of the killer bees. They're all definitely in play. I can't argue against any of them in this spot here. I think it's the highest game of the slate right now. Currently set for 53 points. Tough one to fade.
For whatever reason, people have been sleeping on the Rams and their opponents. I made a good amount of money last week with Rams and Philly game stacks, and then 2 weeks before that, Rams and Saints game stacks. So why not bring it back again this week, looking at quarterbacks Russell Wilson and Jared Goff, game stacking there. Russell Wilson ranks 1st. Jared Goff ranks 3rd in fantasy points among quarterbacks since Week 9. These are the two of the most explosive offenses in the league. Seattle's defense is not what it was in Week 1. What was already an injured secondary, Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, linebackers, both went down last week. I'm unsure of their status right now. The Rams rank 3rd, and the Seahawks rank 4th in points scored since Week 7. Otherwise, nothing really stands out, but it's just 2 of the best quarterbacks, 2 of the best offenses, 2 of the better passing offenses matching up, and I haven't heard much buzz about it yet.
I like that call a lot. We saw an $1,100 uptick in price from Russ after last week on DraftKings, but this is the time of year where Russ gets hotter as the temperatures start to drop. The Rams are top 10 in most passing yards and passing touchdowns allowed. I think they're actually top 6 in both over the past 4 weeks. They've just been a complete liability there in the backfield. I think this is a great spot for Russ. Can't argue against that. I haven't been on Jared Goff while his real life numbers have looked really good. His fantasy outings haven't really caught up. I think a lot of that has to deal with Todd Gurley getting in there to steal some touchdowns. But I do like this game as far as one to target for game stacks. Great call there.
He does get Robert Woods back this week as well. But yeah, outside of that, it looks kind of tricky. There's a lot of guys I have in a similar tier. You could make the case for Drew Brees in a beautiful matchup against the Jets, but at the same time, they're 16-point favorites. So I think we kind of know how game strip's going to shake out there. Probably doesn't need to go too pass heavy. Dak against Oakland, that's a matchup we've been targeting for weeks. You can look at also Matt Ryan's wide receivers are in really good spots this week, so I could see the case for some double stacks there. I also like Case Keenum against the Bengals, who've just been getting lit up by quarterbacks over the past few weeks. They rank 2nd worst over expectation at quarterbacks over their last 5 games. Osweiler put up 15.6 points against them in Week 11. Big Ben put up 19 points against them on the road. Kaiser and Trubisky both put up over 20 points against them. That's just over their last 4 weeks. Their defense is super banged up. Adam Jones Fontes Burfict, Denard, Dunlap, Kirkpatrick, the list goes on and on. So I like Keenum a little bit as well, but outside of that, it's just kind of dumpster diving, looking for cheap options. I have one guy I have my eye on. Let's see if it's if you're on him as well. Who are you looking at when trying to get cheap?
There's two guys that I'm interested in. I either pay up near the top at quarterback, or I'm looking for these bargain bin guys. And the two bargain bin guys I'm debating, well, the first one is Blake Bortles. Love this spot here for him playing against Houston. The game opened with Jacksonville as an 11-point favorite at the beginning of the week. Bortles has averaged 23.4 DraftKings fantasy points over his last three outings, and that was against a much more difficult competition in Arizona, Seattle, and the Colts. He now draws Houston, who rank top 10 in most passing yards allowed, top 5 in most passing touchdowns allowed, and number 1 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Really like Bortles in the spot.
Yeah, I wrote down Bortles too. The one issue I have is that at first this was a monster pass funnel defense, but they've actually been struggling on the ground of late, allowing 4.55 yards per carry since week 9. So I think that given plus the spread, I think they're 10.5 point favorites. I'm not sure if Bortles will really need to throw too much. I could see this being a Fournette game. Going a little bit cheaper, it's going to feel super gross, but I do like Nick Foles a lot. Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie is playing just a part-time role. I don't know why the Giants aren't smart, maybe. Otherwise, I have no excuse. This is a guy who's graded out top 10 among cornerbacks for 6-7 consecutive seasons now. Janoris Jenkins is out. Eli Apple is likely out. Landon Collins, probably the best player on this defense this season, he is also questionable for Week 15. And this is already a Giants defense that ranks bottom 5 in fantasy points over expectation to opposing quarterbacks, 3rd worst in opposing passer rating, 5th worst in fantasy points per dropback allowed. They're surrendering the most 30-yard plays this season, and 7 more than the next closest defense. They also rank as a team 6th in plays per game. You can make the case for Eagles going run heavy without Wentz. I get that for sure, but the matchup's great, and the price is good, and yeah, I don't know. I like it. What do you think?
No, I agree. On paper, it's everything we're looking for. He's got terrific weapons. He's going against a weak pass defense. They're more than 7-point favorites. I like him a lot considering his price tag on both DraftKings and FanDuel, and I think he's a really strong play if you're interested in playing any of FanDuel's new Superflex leagues. He offers a lot of savings there.
Moving on to running backs, let's start with the studs. Who stands out to you? I think it's fairly obvious, but
yeah, it's going to be Le'Veon Bell at 9,300. First time in a month we're finally able to use him on the main slate, but there's not really a ton of value here, and I wouldn't really be opposed to pivoting off him, going down to Mark Ingram instead at 8,200. I think he'd be the top guy I'd want the most exposure to, simply because 16-point spreads really aren't that common in the NFL. That's something you see like in the college level or something. With Josh McCown out of the picture and Bryce Petty taking snaps, this game could be over before most people are on their second beer. Alvin Kamara left last week's game early with a concussion, but he did put in a full day of practice on Wednesday. I really wouldn't be shocked if they took it easy on him, though, with their potential Offensive Rookie of the Year candidate, and leaned much more heavily on Ingram in this one. Over the last 3 years, when Ingram has been a home favorite by more than 7 points, he's averaged 23.5 DK points. Ingram's just been a volume machine despite the arrival of Kamara on the scene, and I think he makes for a great stacking option with the Saints defense. This defense should put them in the field in great field position the entire day. Just love the idea of stacking both of them.
Right, so I'm definitely with you. Bell looks like he's in a great spot. Patriots ranked dead last in yards per carry allowed. They're also allowing the 5th most receiving fantasy points per game. Anyone reading my actual opportunity series knows he's an expected fantasy point superstar. The Patriots tend to sell out to stop an opposing team's top option, but both he and Antonio Brown have a good track record against the Patriots. I'm with you on Mark Ingram, although Alvin Kamara has burned us for how many weeks now. The Jets rank 6th best in yards per carry allowed, but I don't think that matters. As 16-point favorites, that's incredible. And the Saints running backs have been smashing regardless of matchup this season. Todd Gurley deserves mention as well. Leads all players in fantasy points per game. Seahawks are excellent on the ground, but last week proved against the Eagles that that sort of thing doesn't matter for Todd Gurley. And I buy into it, especially thanks to heavy usage as a receiver, keeping him entirely matchup and game script proof. Would you consider Fournette in this stud tier, or would he be the tier right below that?
I think he'd be in the tier right below it for me, just because the other guys are seeing a ton of volume, rushing and receiving. Not so sure about Fournette there.
The thing about Fournette is he has, though, just the past 2 weeks, he's seen 44 carries and 10 targets and all of the goal line work. And the 10 targets to me is what's most interesting, because both these games were easy wins. Both weeks he hit season highs in snap shares. The Jaguars are 11-point favorites. Like I said earlier, Houston's allowing 4.55 yards per carry allowed to opposing running backs since week 9. I probably like Ingram and Bell more, but I think he deserves to be in that discussion among the top names this week.
Yeah, the reason why I don't really want to lump Fournette in with this category is he's only hit 25 receiving yards once this season. That was way back in week 4. I'm not really into this play that much with Fournette here. Yeah, he saw 10 targets, but just didn't do a lot with it. Instead, I'd rather go with a guy who did a lot on the targets he was giving, Jamal Williams. 7 targets last week against the Browns, caught all 7 of them for a very nice 69 yards and a score, 27.3 FanDuel points. Dude's just mauling out there. Really love what he brings to the table. Think he's a very strong play on FanDuel.
Right. So last week he led all running backs in expected fantasy points. Since week 11, he's averaging 20.4 expected fantasy points. That would rank second most among all running backs if over a full season. Over this stretch, he's behind only Todd Gurley in running back snap share, 96%, running back touch share, 92%. It's a tough matchup against Carolina. And what worries me a little bit is if Aaron Rodgers changes things coming back into this offense. Maybe they go a little less run heavy. I'm not sure, but really I'm with you. I think he's one of the top plays of the slate.
Yeah, and that uncertainty is kind of like what I've made a lot of money on in the past, is how are teams going to react to new players coming into the fold. We don't know exactly, are they going to ease Aaron Rodgers in and lean on the running game? We don't know that information at this time. Those are the kind of uncertainties I like to wager against, and I project them to go heavy with Jamal Williams here.
So I think there's still a good amount of value this week. I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on injuries. Maybe some guys come back, some guys don't. But I think Gio Bernard is still a really strong play. He has another bad matchup, but the volume's going to be there. Last week he saw 11 of the team's 13 carries, 8 of the team's 9 running back targets. Theo Riddick, we can lump into that crew as well. Over the last 2 games with Amir Abdullah inactive, he's averaging 16 expected fantasy points per game. That's 9th among running backs over the past 2 weeks. 19 carries, 15 targets, playing on 67% of the snaps. I think he's still a really strong salary saver this week. Samaje Perine, he's going to see an even larger role this week, I imagine, after Byron Marshall was placed on injured reserve. He's joining Chris Thompson, Rob Kelly, Keith Marshall. That depleted backfield now is just really paving the way for P. Ryan to be used in a monster bell cow workload. He's seeing really good volume recently, ranks 6th among running backs in expected fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. Arizona ranks 5th best in yards per carry, but still, given this kind of workload we can project for him, as well as their 4.5 point favorites, I think he's a really strong DFS option this week. And then there are 2 guys who, due to running back injuries, I think are fantastic values. One, I think, is the stone cold chalk of the week. You want to guess who I'm thinking about?
Yeah, it's got to be Kenyan Drake.
Right.
He should easily be the most heavily owned running back this week. Showed over the last 2 weeks where he had 26 and 30 touches that he can stand up to a heavy workload. He played on 79% and 90% of the team's offensive snaps during that span. That's typically what we see out of elite backs. So that really shouldn't go unnoticed for Drake, despite him still seeing that bargain price tag of $5,800. That's just DK being slow to react because of the game being on Monday Night Football, and we should all be taking advantage of that this week. He's going to be a plug and play. Taking on the Bills without Marcel Darius, they've just been a complete sieve to opposing running backs. Buffalo ranks top 6 in rushing yards allowed and 1st in most rushing touchdowns allowed by their opponents. Drake's going to be the chalk this week. There's very little reason to fade him.
Absolutely right. I'm in complete agreement with you and well argued. The other kind of value running back I'm looking at is Mike Davis. I'm on him for all the same reasons we were on him last week. He left last week's game early with an injury. So he's played 3 games thus far, and 2 of which he's left early with an injury. But really he's only played on 9 quarters of football this season. So if we look at what he's done and break it down per 4 quarters, he's averaging 16.4 carries, 3.6 targets, 100.0 total yards. And keep in mind the bulk of these were in tough matchups against the Eagles, Jacksonville, who's been much improved on run defense lately. And this week the matchup looks good. The Rams rank 2nd worst in yards per carry allowed, 3rd worst in total fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. I got a few more running backs on my list. Who's next on yours, Tyler?
I like that call, especially because Davis is still carrying that injury designation. Could see him being a little bit under-owned. Very nice play there. Guy that I like is Alex Collins. Really think he's a great play this week. Since the Ravens Week 10 bye, Collins has averaged 19.8 touches per game, 20.6 DraftKings points. Takes on a Cleveland defense who's typically been a pass funnel defense that we target, but the Browns haven't been as sturdy on the ground as of late. They just allowed Jamal Williams 30.8 fantasy points, Melvin Gordon 14.6, and Joe Mixon 25.5. They've all had great outings against them over the past 3 weeks. Collins has been a steady fantasy producer over the last month. Really wouldn't fault anyone at all for locking him in here. Kind of amazed that Baltimore's a 7-point road favorite here in this matchup. Just one more reason to like Collins this week, though.
Right. I'm with you. Volume has been good. Efficiency has been fantastic. He's our 8th highest rated running back. He ranks 3rd best in yards per carry, 7th best in elusive rating. One thing that does have me nervous is that over the last 3 weeks, he's seen 0 carries inside the 5, while Javorius Allen has seen 2. That does have me nervous, but I'm not sure it's a death knell. I think could be due to him being hyper efficient inside the 10, but it is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, they weren't too far. I was looking at their touches inside the 10. Allen had 5, Collins had 4, so they were kind of neck and neck there.
Right. Speaking of, I guess, committee-like situations, we're back to debating the Minnesota running backs because this is a dream-ish matchup, and I don't think people are going to realize just how good it is. First of all, the Vikings are 11-point favorites, implying good game script. That works more towards Latavius Murray's favor. But this Cincinnati Bengals defense, as we alluded to before, is super banged up, a ton of injuries all over the defense. I think Vontaze Burfict just suffered a concussion too. He's questionable. Cincinnati's allowing the fourth most rushing fantasy points per game since week 9. They've also allowed 106 receiving yards to Le'Veon Bell, 54 receiving yards to Devontae Booker. For the season, they're allowing the fourth most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I lean Latavius Murray because of that game script, because Cincinnati's slightly more vulnerable to running backs on the ground. Also, he has 7 of the team's 9 carries inside the 5-yard line over the last 6 weeks, though they are about even in expected fantasy points per game. I think Latavius Murray's a good play this week. Tyler, you fought me every time I've ever brought up Latavius Murray, who I still contend McKinnon's the better player, but I think Murray's the better play this week.
I actually tend to agree this week.
Yes.
So I was just looking at our Pro Football Focus DFS lineup optimizer. Latavius is the number 2 value running back on DraftKings, the number 5 value running back on FanDuel.
Wow.
So we like him a lot here at Pro Football Focus, and I'm going to side with the company, be a corporate man today.
All right, give me another running back, Tyler.
One guy that I've had very little success picking his winning weeks is Jordan Howard. But I think he's in play here against the Lions. They've given up a ton to opposing running backs lately. Over the past 4 weeks, they've given up the 5th most rushing yards and the most total touchdowns to opposing running backs. Last time Howard played Detroit, he went off for 125 yards and a score. That was on just 15 carries. Last week should give some hope that Mitch Trubisky can keep pace with the passing offense, prevent Chicago from getting completely blown out. But, I mean, we've seen it time and time again. Howard is as game script dependent as they come. Unfortunately, he's also at a lofty price tag where if you're wagering on the wrong side of how that game goes, you could get bit pretty hard. That being said, I think he's only a FanDuel GPP play for me.
So the next running back I'm going to talk up, I'm a little bit embarrassed. I'm hoping, I'm praying that my good buddy Evan Silva of RotoWorld is not listening, because he will never let me live this down. I'm about to hype up Rex Burkhead. It's just absurd. He's assumed the Mike Gillislee goal line back role. He's assumed at least a significant portion of the James White passing down back role. Since week 8, he leads all New England running backs in targets, red zone opportunities, and he ranks 2nd in carries. Over the last 5 weeks of the season, he ranks 7th among all running backs in both expected and actual fantasy points per game. He ranks 3rd in expected touchdowns. Right now, per Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, he's a low-end RB2. By DFS salary, he's more of an RB3. I have him as a low-end RB1 in my rankings this week, so I imagine I'm going to be heavily invested in Burkhead this week. What do you think about that, Tyler?
I kind of tend to like it, especially with no Shazier in the fold, unfortunately. I think Burkhead's a pretty good play here.
All right, moving on to wide receivers. I guess we should start with the guy who deserves to be mentioned at the top, and that's Antonio Brown, who's on pace for really a historic wide receiver season. We know the Patriots sell out to stop the opposing team's top weapon. Tyler Lochner wrote a really great article for us examining whether or not that is the case, and he found that to be true. But still, Antonio Brown averages 17.2 fantasy points per game in his career against New England. Should be a high-scoring game. I feel like worst case scenario, there's going to be plenty of garbage time for him. Julio Jones is in just as good of a spot as he was a few weeks ago, the last time he played Tampa Bay. Since 2014, he averages 28.7 fantasy points per game against Tampa Bay. That's crazy. They're allowing the most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. But really, it's a great matchup for Mohamed Sanu as well, considering Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. I also like Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs quite a bit against Cincinnati with Adam Jones out, Drake Kirkpatrick limited, Kyle Rudolph dealing with an ankle injury. Tyler, what do you think about the Minnesota wide receivers?
Yeah, love that call with Thielen. Think he's going to be a great stacking option with Case Keenum. Since week 10, Thielen leads all wide receivers in yards after the catch. That's while sporting a 45% market share of the team's air yards. That means Thielen is not only seeing a ton of downfield targets, but he's also picking up a ton of yardage via big chunks after the catch, no matter where he catches the ball on the field. Like you alluded to earlier, Cincinnati has a ton of injuries in the secondary. They just placed Pac-Man Jones on IR. Drake Kirkpatrick and Darqueze Dennard were both DNPs on Wednesday. Thielen's been one of this year's biggest fantasy breakout stars. I love the idea of rostering him against a bunch of backup cornerbacks by the Bengals.
We could also look at Keenan Allen, who has over 100 yards in each of his last 4 games, as well as 4 touchdowns over that stretch. The matchup looks good. Keenan Allen runs 29% of his routes from the left. Kansas City's allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing left wide receivers. He also runs 51% of his routes from the slot. Kansas City's allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. So really a dream matchup for him on 80% of his routes. And then just the other 20% against Marcus Peters. We could also look at Brandon Cooks. Pittsburgh is giving up the most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receivers over the last 5 weeks. They're also giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game on deep targets since losing Joe Hayden. Really a gigantic loss for that defense. And Brandon Cooks is obviously the top deep receiver on New England. More than double the next closest receiver in total deep targets. I'm still on Josh Gordon this week. There's no Jimmy Smith for Baltimore. Baltimore ranks 4th worst over expectation to wide receiver ones over the past 5 weeks. We just saw Antonio Brown drop 213 yards on them. Tyler, I know you like Devin Funchess, so when you make a quick case for him as well.
Yeah, I really like the idea of stacking him with Cam, as I mentioned earlier. Since Kelvin's departure, Funchess has had a 28% target market share, seeing nearly 8 targets per game. He leads the team in red zone targets and red zone touchdowns, and they're implied for one of the highest team totals of the week, and what could potentially be a shootout here with Green Bay now that Aaron Rodgers is back in the fold. Think he should have a great game here against Devon House and Demarius Randall.
I also like Marvin Jones against Chicago. He runs the plurality, 48% of his routes from the right. Chicago is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing right wide receivers. Meanwhile, they're good against left wide receivers. They're just average to the slot. Looking at my expected fantasy points data, Kyle Fuller actually leads all cornerbacks in expected fantasy points per route and coverage. So really, opposing teams are going out of their way to target him deep, target him near the end zone. That should bode well for Marvin Jones. I also like Jordy Nelson. He's getting Aaron Rodgers back. He's $1,000 cheaper than Devonta Adams on DraftKings, $100 cheaper on FanDuel. He played on just 7 snaps in week 2, but if we exclude that, he led all wide receivers in fantasy points per game prior to Rodgers' injury. He is up against a Carolina defense ranking 2nd worst over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones over the past 5 weeks. Also the 4th most fantasy points per game to right wide receivers, which is where Jordy Nelson runs the plurality of his routes.
So I gotta interrupt here for a second. Do you think there's a big difference here between Jordy Nelson and Devontae Adams? Their pricing on DraftKings and FanDuel is kind of interesting. On DK, they're separated by $1,000. On FanDuel, it's $100. Which wide receiver from the Packers would you prefer?
Yeah, I got to go with Jordy. I think we have the longer history of extreme chemistry with him and Rodgers. Adams had this nice little breakout, but all of it was with Brett Hundley as quarterback. So I can't help but imagine that once Rodgers comes back, it's going to go back to the days of old where Jordy's being peppered with end zone targets and deep targets, just wide open over the middle of the field and deep. I don't know. Are you truthering for Adams right now?
No, I couldn't agree more that Jordy Nelson is definitely Aaron Rodgers' guy. We saw in the beginning of the year in their 5 games they played to start the 2017 season, Nelson was averaging 18 PPR points per game. During the 7 games with Brett Hundley, that dropped down to 5.33. Massive change. I think now that Rodgers is back in the fold, we got to go back to Nelson here.
Good stats all around. I like Demaryius Thomas quite a bit. So he actually ranks 3rd among all receivers in expected fantasy points since week 9. He's seen a greater expected fantasy point workload than Emmanuel Sanders in 7 consecutive games. Sanders is still dealing with his injury. Indianapolis is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. Really, they're starting 4th and 5th string cornerbacks now. And Thomas is just the 29th most expensive wide receiver on DraftKings. I like Larry Fitzgerald quite a bit. He's been hyper productive, hyper efficient. He's seen a great workload in terms of expected fantasy points. So a really dependable workload, and the Redskins defense has been funnelish this season. I wanted to note that Michael Thomas actually saw a career high in expected fantasy points and targets in week 14. I wonder if that had something to do with the Saints' second leading receiver, Alvin Kamara, playing on just 6 snaps due to a concussion. If Kamara is out again, Thomas has to be pretty chalky. Jets are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers this season. Michael Crabtree's in play. Dallas is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. I also like Jamison Crowder quite a bit. We know Patrick Peterson's not going to shadow. He's averaging 9.2 targets per game over his last 6 games. Arizona's allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. For a similar reason, I like Cooper Kupp quite a bit. I feel like Robert Woods is going to draw all the attention, all of the ownership, all of the buzz. But he's going to be moving back to full-time slot duties. And Seattle's allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. As we mentioned earlier, Seattle's dealing with quite a bit of injuries to their linebacking and safety core. Tyler, give me the name of a wide receiver or 2 you're interested in.
Just to say, there's some great plays that you're on. I like those calls a lot. Alshon Jeffrey's the guy I think that DK pricing went a bit too far with this week. We saw with Nick Foles in the fold that Alshon saw over 30% of the targets during that time once Carson Wentz went down. No Janoris Jenkins this week. Just really like the matchup here for Alshon, especially against this Giant secondary that's given up. Looking a little bit lower in price, guy I'm super into this week is DeDe Westbrook, 5,100. He's been outperforming Marquise Lee since his debut. Opposing outside burners have done very well against Houston. T.Y. Hilton, Brandon Cooks, and Paul Richardson have all netted 30-plus DraftKings fantasy points against the Texans. Westbrook is averaging 8.3 targets per game over his past 4, and he's just been killing it out there. He's just been a guy I've been happily rostering each week at these bargain salaries, and I still think he's priced far too low at just 5,100.
Absolutely, I'm with you. So since his NFL debut, he ranks 14th among all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game. In total, 17.7 expected fantasy points, more than Marquise Lee, 9 more targets, 4 more deep targets. That latter stat is most important to me. He ran a 4.34 40-yard dash in March at Oklahoma's Pro Day, and Houston is giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game on deep targets. It also ranks bottom 5 on a per-target basis. I like Marquise Goodwin a good amount for much the same reasons we liked him last week. He's a little bit more expensive, but Tennessee is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. Doug Baldwin, he's in a neutral matchup, but I mean, he did total 30.2 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks in the two literal toughest matchups for a slot wide receiver. The Rams are most vulnerable to the slot, but really they're about average, above average everywhere. Last person I wanted to mention was Roger Lewis, who saw 11 targets and 20.3 expected fantasy points last week. That's more than the combination of Evan Ingram and Sterling Shepard. He has a much softer matchup than Shepard this week. Shepard's going to draw Patrick Robinson, top 3 graded cornerback. Eagles are allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. Meanwhile, they're allowing the second most to outside wide receivers. But I think that's it for wide receivers for me. Tyler, who else did you want to mention?
Yeah, man, you went through a lot of names there. It's 16-game slate. There's just a ton of different options at wide receiver. 2 different guys I just wanted to add at the very end. Juju Smith-Schuster, I think he's a great mid-priced option. We saw last week the Steelers throw for 500-plus passing yards without Juju. Imagine him back in the fold. He's going to get a large chunk of that if they repeat their passing success against the Patriots. Another guy I just want to mention real quick is Corey Coleman, 4,400, just like the matchup here. I think he and Josh Gordon are forming quite the tandem, and we could see them form their own kind of dynamic duo of Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, where those 2 wide receivers are seeing the majority of the targets.
All right, Tyler, good arguments there. Let's move on to the tight end position. Who stands out to you?
The guy in bright red because of his bright red jersey and the way I feel about him, Travis Kelce, 7K. Man, I owned 100% of Kelce in tournaments last week, and it was a brutal weekend of tilting. Missing out on 3 potential touchdowns from Kelce. Just narrowly missed a massive payday, and I feel bad for anybody that rostered Kelce and stacked him with Alex Smith.
That would be me, and that was a brutally tilting 30-point swing, not in my favor. Those were the majority of my main lineups on both sites. Meanwhile, every other lineup I had cashed. Definitely tilting. Also had 100% exposure to Kelce, but I still feel good about it. And I feel good about him this week, even though the matchup's fairly tough. Over the past 5 weeks of the season, he leads all tight ends in expected fantasy points with 17.6, or 4 points more than the next closest tight end. Among all receivers, he ranks 7th in expected fantasy points per game over that stretch. That's really absurd. Volume, as we alluded to right there. He did get fairly unlucky last week. So it's a good bet for some positive regression maybe heading into this week. Although really there's not much separating him from Rob Gronkowski, who I have above him in raw projections. Pittsburgh's been one of the best defenses in the league against tight ends this year, both recently and over the course of the full season. But Gronk has really dominated Pittsburgh throughout his career. He has 3 career games of 29 plus fantasy points against Pittsburgh. That's in just 5 career games against Pittsburgh. And in the other 2 games, he still went over 90 yards in each. In one of them, he had a touchdown. 3 career 29 plus point games. For perspective, Jordan Reed just has 3 career 29 point games, period. Still, I'm going to buy more into that Pittsburgh's actually a fairly tough matchup for tight ends, and not read too much into those historical stats, but at the same time, it's Rob Gronkowski. You're not really going to pay too much attention to the matchup anyway, just because he's a Hall of Famer, and probably no receiver has the touchdown upside he does on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, no real arguments against that. They're in the highest scoring game of the week. It's a game we should target the heck out of with Pittsburgh and New England Patriots players. Looking down a bit at the price tag, going down our list, guy that I like a lot is Zach Ertz. We saw last week and every other week, that Ertz has missed that even when their stud tight end is out for the game, the tight end position is an integral one in Doug Peterson's passing offense. Trey Burton filled in that Ertz role last week, going 5 for 71 and 2 scores. The concussion worry has dropped Ertz down from that lofty high 6K salary over the past 2 months that he was seeing down to just 6K flat. I really like that savings we're getting here, considering he's being priced up with Gronk and Kelsey. But this is against a Giants defense that has allowed 10 straight weeks of touchdowns to open the season against opposing tight ends. They've allowed the most fantasy points by far to the position. They currently rank top 5 in most receptions, first in receiving yards, and first in receiving touchdowns. Ertz has already cleared concussion protocol. He was a full participant in practice on Wednesday. Just take the 1K savings from Ertz and profit.
I'm with you, man. It's a dream matchup. There's definitely concern with the quarterback change. And I want to say that the Giants are really vulnerable everywhere now because they are. But at the same time, Landon Collins is probably the best defensive player in that secondary this season, the primary defender of tight ends. And it's looking like he's not going to play this week. And Collins had said earlier in the season that Ertz was his toughest matchup throughout his career. So I think Ertz should have a field day with his defense, regardless of who's going to be manning the helm at quarterback. I also like Delanie Walker quite a bit. He's still too cheap on both sites. He ranks second among tight ends in expected fantasy points over the last 5 weeks, 5th over the course of the full season. He's been fairly efficient as well. No Jaquiski Tart for the 49ers means this is, at worst, just an average matchup. I also like Jack Doyle against Denver. Denver ranks 7th worst fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing tight ends. A high percentage of their receiving fantasy points going to tight ends, actually the highest rate, and that's been the highest rate in the league for the past 2 seasons. Volume has fallen off a little bit for Doyle in recent weeks. 5 or fewer targets in 3 of his last 4.